One tennis match did not magically fix inequality in American sports, but on one night in 1973, it forced the country to watch its own assumptions in real time. By the end of this story, you'll understand why Billie Jean King's win over Bobby Riggs was not just a strange exhibition match between a 29-year-old champion and a 55-year-old showman. You'll see why the match became a national argument about women's ability, women's pay, women's pressure, and who gets to be taken seriously. The match was called the Battle of the Sexes. That name sounds almost cartoonish now. At the time, it was a perfect label for the spectacle America wanted. A man against a woman, old confidence against new ambition, a former champion shouting that women belonged in their place, and a woman champion who understood that if she lost, millions of people would treat it as proof. That is the key to the whole story. Billie Jean King was not only trying to beat Bobby Riggs, she was trying to stop him from turning one tennis match into a verdict on every woman athlete in the country. And the reason the night mattered so much is that Riggs almost succeeded before the match even began. To understand why, you have to start with the America around the court. In the early 1970s, women's sports were still treated as secondary entertainment. Female athletes trained hard, traveled constantly, filled draws, won championships, and drew fans, but they were often paid far less than men. Many tournaments offered women a fraction of the prize money. Media coverage could be dismissive. A woman could be a world-class competitor and still be asked to smile, be grateful, and accept that the real prestige belonged somewhere else. This was not only about tennis. Across schools and colleges, girls and women often had fewer teams, worse facilities, smaller budgets, and lower expectations. Title IX, the landmark American education law that prohibited sex-based discrimination in federally funded education programs, had been passed in 1972, just 1 year before the match. But a law on paper does not change a culture overnight. The fight over what women deserved was still raw, public, and unsettled. Tennis became one of the places where that fight was easiest to see. Billie Jean King was already one of the greatest players in the world. She had won major singles titles, doubles titles, and mixed doubles titles. She was not a novelty. She was not a symbol first and an athlete second. She was an elite competitor with a record that demanded respect. But King also understood something many athletes were trained to avoid. Sports were political, whether athletes admitted it or not. Prize money was political. Court assignments were political. Television coverage was political. The decision to treat a women's final as less valuable than a men's final was political. And if women players did not organize, the system would keep rewarding them less while telling them to be patient. In 1970, King and a group of women players took a major risk. They broke away from the tennis establishment and helped create a separate women's professional tour, backed by Virginia Slims. The group is often remembered as the Original Nine. They signed symbolic $1 contracts because the point was not immediate wealth. The point was control. They wanted a professional circuit where women could compete, earn, and build leverage. That move helped change tennis, but it also made King a target. She was not just winning matches. She was challenging the way the sport was organized. Then came Bobby Riggs. Riggs was not just some random loudmouth. He had been a serious player in his time. He won major titles in the 1930s and 1940s and was known for his tactical mind, his gamesmanship, and his appetite for gambling and publicity. By 1973, he was far past his competitive prime, but he knew how to sell a show. He leaned into a character, the self-declared male chauvinist who claimed women's tennis was inferior, who joked that women belonged in the kitchen, and who insisted that even at 55, he could beat the top women in the game. Some of it was performance, but the performance worked because it echoed beliefs many people already had. Riggs understood the media. He gave reporters clean conflict. He gave television a villain. He gave audiences a simple question. Could a top woman beat an aging male champion? That question was unfair from the beginning. If King won, critics could say Riggs was old. If she lost, they could say it proved women were weaker competitors. The setup gave him room to spin almost any outcome. At first, King did not want to play him. She believed the match could become a circus, and she had reason to be cautious. A spectacle like that could reduce everything women players were building into a single stunt. So, Riggs played another top woman first, Margaret Court. Court was one of the greatest champions in tennis history. She had an extraordinary record and a powerful game. If Riggs wanted credibility for his challenge, beating Court would give it to him. In May 1973, he did exactly that. The match became known as the Mother's Day Massacre. Riggs beat Court decisively, 6-2, 6-1. He used lobs, spins, drop shots, changes of pace, and psychological pressure. He did not try to out-hit her like a younger player. He disrupted her rhythm. He made the match awkward. He turned the court into a puzzle. That result changed everything. Now, Riggs was not just a clown with a microphone. He was a clown with a victory over one of the greatest women players alive. And the public reaction was exactly what King feared. For people who already believed women's tennis was inferior, the court match felt like confirmation. This is where the stakes tightened around Billie Jean King. She could no longer ignore Riggs. If she refused, the story might remain. Bobby Riggs challenged the women, beat Margaret Court, and proved his point. It did not matter that the conclusion was lazy. It did not matter that one match never proves an entire gender's athletic worth. The culture was ready to use it that way. King later made clear in different interviews over the years that she felt she had to play. The exact wording changes by account, but the logic is consistent. After Court lost, King believed the responsibility had shifted. The match was no longer optional. It had become a public test women had not asked for but could not avoid. And that is what makes the story so tense. King was not walking into a normal contest. She was walking into a trap built out of television, sexism, hype, and national curiosity. Riggs had already shown his plan. He would turn the match into theater. He would exaggerate the gender war. He would make himself impossible to ignore. And if he could get King emotional, impatient, or careless, he might be able to use the same style that had beaten Court. King had to do something harder than play well. She had to refuse the script he wanted her to follow. The match was scheduled for September 20th, 1973, at the Houston Astrodome. That setting mattered. The Astrodome was not an intimate tennis venue. It was a giant stadium built for spectacle. More than 30,000 people attended, an enormous crowd for a tennis match. Television brought it to millions more, with some estimates often citing tens of millions in the United States and a worldwide audience that may have reached around 90 million. Even if exact audience numbers vary by source, the larger point is clear. This was not hidden inside the sports pages. It was prime-time American culture. The entrance itself was part of the message. Riggs arrived in a rickshaw surrounded by women models, playing up his chauvinist character. King entered on a decorated litter carried by men, matching the theater with theater. The scene was absurd, almost carnival-like, but underneath the jokes, the stakes were serious. That contrast is one of the reasons the match still fascinates people. It looked like a circus, but it carried real consequences. Riggs presented King with a giant lollipop. King gave Riggs a piglet, a jab at his male chauvinist pig persona. The crowd laughed. Cameras loved it. Everyone got the show they had been promised. Then the match began, and the circus stopped helping Riggs. King had studied what happened to Court. She understood that Riggs wanted to slow the game down, change the pace, and draw errors. He wanted to make her overhit. He wanted to make her prove something with every swing. That is how pressure works. It whispers that you must win beautifully, quickly, and obviously, or people will doubt you. King did not give him that satisfaction. Instead, she played with discipline. She stayed patient. She kept the ball in play. She made Riggs move. She used the width of the court. She avoided turning the match into a reckless power contest. She made it physical and tactical. She made him work for points again and again. The first set was the most dangerous because it would shape the emotional temperature of the night. If Riggs won it, the crowd could surge behind the idea of an upset. The jokes would sharpen. The pressure on King would multiply. Riggs, the showman, would have exactly what he wanted: belief. King won the first set 6-4. That score matters because it was close enough to keep the tension alive. This was not an instant demolition. Riggs was still in the match. The audience still had uncertainty. King still had to prove that her plan could hold. But psychologically, the first set changed the room. Riggs was no longer controlling the story. King had shown she could absorb the noise and play her match. In the second set, her control became clearer. She kept testing his movement. She kept refusing panic. Riggs had built the promotion around personality, but personality does not chase balls forever. At 55, against an elite player in her athletic prime, he needed shortcuts. He needed King to miss. He needed her to get tight. She did not. King won the second set, 6-3. Now the match had a different meaning. It was no longer, can Billie Jean King survive the spectacle? It was, can Bobby Riggs find anything that works? For a man who had sold the world on his confidence, that was a brutal reversal. The third set completed it. King continued to press him without losing control. Riggs, who had spent months talking, now had no argument left except the score. And the score said exactly what King needed it to say. Billie Jean King defeated Bobby Riggs 6-4, 6-3, 6-3. Straight sets. No escape hatch. No dramatic collapse. No need for excuses. She had not just beaten him. She had managed the pressure, solved the tactics, and denied him the one thing he needed most: ambiguity. That is why the match landed so hard. If King had barely survived, skeptics could have shrugged. If Riggs had taken her deep into a chaotic struggle, people could have spun the result as a novelty. But a straight-set win made the message cleaner. The man who had said women were not good enough had been beaten clearly by the woman he had challenged. Still, the real importance of the match was not that it proved women could beat men in tennis. That would be the wrong lesson. A 29-year-old female champion beating a 55-year-old male former champion does not settle every debate about strength, speed, biology, or direct competition across sports. Billie Jean King herself understood that the match was symbolic. The point was not to claim that all women could beat all men. The point was to destroy a lazy cultural assumption that women athletes were automatically unserious, inferior, and undeserving of equal respect. Riggs had tried to make one match stand for the weakness of women. King turned it into a demonstration of women's competence under maximum pressure. That distinction is everything. The battle of the sexes mattered because it reached people who did not normally follow women's tennis. It entered living rooms, bars, newspapers, talk shows, and family arguments. It gave Americans a simple image they could not easily ignore: a woman athlete, in control, on the biggest stage, beating the man who had mocked her. For girls watching, the meaning could be direct. Here was a woman not apologizing for wanting to win. Here was a woman not laughing off disrespect. Here was a woman carrying pressure that had been placed on her by an entire culture and still executing. For boys and men watching, the match challenged a comfortable joke. It is easy to dismiss women's sports in the abstract. It is harder when the scoreboard contradicts you in prime time. For sponsors, broadcasters, and tournament organizers, the match showed that women's sports could draw massive attention when treated as a major event. The audience was not the problem. The lack of investment was the problem. That is part of the legacy people sometimes miss. The match did not happen in isolation. It came during a larger transformation in women's tennis. The women's tour was growing. Players were organizing. The push for equal prize money was becoming louder. In 1973, the U.S. Open became the first of the major tennis tournaments to offer equal prize money to men and women, a change strongly associated with King's advocacy. So when King beat Riggs, she did not create the movement from nothing. She gave it a powerful public victory. That is often how culture changes. Not through one event alone, but through one event that suddenly makes years of work visible. Before the match, women players had already been fighting for money, respect, and opportunity. After the match, more people understood why the fight mattered. The victory gave supporters a story they could point to. It gave critics less room to hide behind jokes. It gave the women's game a surge of attention at exactly the moment it was building institutions that could use it. But there is another layer to the story, and it makes King's performance even more remarkable. She was carrying public pressure while also living under private constraints. In the early 1970s, King was not publicly out as gay. The cultural climate was hostile, and athletes could lose endorsements, reputation, and opportunities over their personal lives. This part of her story became more public later, but even without turning the match into a biography of her private life, it is important to understand the era. King was operating in a world that demanded women be marketable in narrow ways. Female athletes were judged not only by how they played, but by how they looked, spoke, dressed, and fit expectations of femininity. So when she entered the Astrodome, she was not just representing women's athletic ability. She was also navigating the rules placed on women in public life. Be strong, but not too aggressive. Be confident, but not arrogant. Be entertaining, but not unserious. Be a champion, but do not make people uncomfortable. Riggs could be outrageous and be rewarded for it. King had to be brilliant and controlled at the same time. That double standard is part of what the match exposed. Riggs's behavior was often treated as fun. King's response had to be measured, because if she appeared too angry, critics could use that against her. If she joked too much, they could say she was not focused. If she lost, they could say she proved him right. If she won, she still had to explain why the win mattered without sounding to hostile ears like she was asking for too much. The trap was not just on the court, it was in the interpretation. King escaped it by winning so clearly that the simplest interpretation became the strongest one. She was better that night. She handled the moment. She deserved respect. After the match, Bobby Riggs did not vanish from history, but his argument lost its power. He had been useful to television because he made sexism entertaining. King made equality harder to mock. That does not mean America changed overnight. Women athletes continued to fight for fair pay, coverage, facilities, coaching, medical support, and professional opportunities. Many still do. Even today, debates about women's sports often repeat old patterns with new names. People still use isolated examples to make sweeping claims. They still compare without context. They still treat women's competitions as if they must constantly justify their existence. That is why the battle of the sexes remains more than a tennis story. It shows how a society can turn a game into a courtroom. It shows how an athlete can be forced to represent far more than herself. And it shows why winning in the right moment can shift the terms of a national conversation. But the match also warns us about symbols. Symbols are powerful, but they can be simplified. If the only lesson is Billie Jean King beat Bobby Riggs, the story becomes trivia. If the lesson is one woman proved women are equal, it becomes too neat. The deeper lesson is more useful. Respect is not granted automatically, even to the best. Sometimes it has to be organized for, argued for, and then performed under pressure so publicly that denial becomes embarrassing. King's genius was that she understood all three parts. She was an athlete, she was an organizer, and on that night, she was a strategist inside a spectacle designed to diminish her. The match's cultural shock came from the collision between what many Americans expected and what they saw. They expected comedy, maybe chaos, maybe a stunt. They saw a champion dismantle a narrative. They saw that the jokes had consequences. They saw that women athletes were not asking for charity. They were asking for the chance to compete, earn, and be judged by their excellence. That is what changed attitudes. Not everyone's, and not completely, but enough to matter. Imagine the risk from King's side. She already had a career. She already had titles. She did not need a circus match to prove she could play tennis. In pure sporting terms, the match was almost beneath her. Riggs was decades older. The setup was theatrical. The whole thing could have cheapened her resume. But culturally, she recognized the danger of leaving Riggs unanswered. His win over Margaret Court had created a story that could damage women's tennis at a fragile moment. King stepped into that story and rewrote the ending. That is the reason her victory still echoes. Not because the match was the highest level of tennis ever played. Not because it solved every problem. Not because the gender debate was simple. It echoes because King understood that public perception can shape opportunity. If people believe women's sports are second-rate, they fund them like second-rate products. They schedule them badly. They cover them lazily. They pay them less. Then they point to the smaller audience created by that neglect as evidence that women deserve less. King was fighting that cycle. The Astrodome match broke through because it made millions of people pay attention at once. It gave women's tennis a moment too large to dismiss. It turned a sexist publicity stunt into a platform for legitimacy. And the most satisfying part is that King did it through tennis itself, not through a speech after a loss, not through a moral appeal alone. She did it by reading the opponent, choosing the right tactics, controlling her emotions, and winning the points. The scoreboard carried the argument. That is why the battle of the sexes can still teach us something about sports and culture. The loudest person in the room often frames the debate. Riggs framed the match as a joke about women. King reframed it as a test of seriousness. He wanted the audience to watch a woman fail. She made them watch a woman perform. In the end, the match changed America's attitude toward women in sports because it exposed how much of that attitude had been built on assumption rather than evidence. Before the match, people could say women's tennis was not compelling. Then, a massive audience watched it. They could say women athletes could not handle pressure. Then King handled one of the strangest pressure chambers in sports history. They could say the demand for equality was just politics. Then King showed that the politics were tied directly to performance, money, and respect. One night did not finish the fight, but it gave the fight a picture, a scoreline, and a champion. Billie Jean King walked into the Astrodome with more than a racket. She carried the consequences of a loss that would have been used against people who never agreed to be represented by it. She left with a victory that did not prove women had nothing left to fight for, but proved they could not be laughed out of the arena. That is the real legacy of September 1973. A man built a spectacle to defend an old hierarchy. A woman used that spectacle to weaken it. And millions of Americans had to reconsider what they thought they knew about women who compete. If this story stays with you, it should not be because it was strange, though it was. It should be because it shows how much can depend on who controls the meaning of a moment. Bobby Riggs tried to make the match a punchline. Billie Jean King made it evidence. So here is the question to leave with. When we remember the battle of the sexes, are we remembering a strange tennis exhibition? Or are we remembering the moment a champion forced a country to rethink who deserved to be taken seriously? If you want more stories where tennis changes more than the scoreboard, keep watching.